Eradicating poverty in all its forms remains one of the greatest challenges facing the world. The UN is fighting poverty in many ways. Today, I would like to talk to you about two projects launched by the organization. The first one came to an end in 2015, while the second one is a continuation of the first and is still active today. The Millennium Development Goals were 8 objectives which aimed to eliminate poverty and inequality in developing countries only. And they were to eradicate extreme poverty and hunger, to achieve universal primary education, to promote gender equality and empower women, to reduce child mortality, to improve maternal health, to combat HIV, AIDS, malaria, and other diseases, to ensure environmental sustainability, and to develop a global partnership for development. Quindi la creazione di una comunità che collabora, no, per lo sviluppo è sempre al centro dell'organizzazione. They were adopted by all 193 member states at the UN's Millennium Summit in 2000, the purpose of which was to discuss the role of the United Nations at the turn of the 21st century. 2015 was the target year for achieving all goals. And while the UN coordinated global efforts to achieve them, the primary responsibility for meeting the objectives was of the member states. So what was achieved? Some examples. The number of people living on less than $1.25 a day decreased by over 400 million in the period from 1990 to 2005. In the developing world as a whole, enrollment in primary education reached 89% in 2009. Deaths of children under 5 have declined steadily worldwide from 12.4 million in 1990 to around 8.1 million in 2009. And by the end of 2010, 90% of the world's inhabitants were covered by mobile cellular signal. And what is yet to be achieved? Major challenges remain. For example, the current economic crisis and increased food prices are having a particularly strong impact on the poorest people across the world. Poor and vulnerable groups are also expected to be hit the hardest by climate change. In the developing world, over 15% of people, including 1/4 of children under 5, are undernourished. More than 10% of children of primary school age are out of school. Over 2.5 billion people still lack flushing toilets and other forms of sanitation. And every year, some 500,000 women and girls die as a result of complications during pregnancy or childbirth. And almost all of these deaths, 99%, occur in developing countries. This is why in September 2015, the leaders of all member states of the UN adopted Agenda 2030, a universal agenda that contains 17 goals this time that are based on the success of the Millennium Development Goals. It aims to go further to end all forms of poverty by 2030. And the United Nations conducted the biggest public survey in its history to ask which issues should be included in the goals. And the goals are no poverty, no hunger, good health, quality education, gender equality, clean water and sanitation, clean energy, good jobs and economic growth, innovation and infrastructure, reduced inequalities, sustainable cities and communities, responsible consumption, protect the planet, life below water, life on land, peace and justice, and partnerships for the goals. Sustainable development can be defined as development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. So sustainable development is a kind of development that is good for the present and is good for the future. The goals are not legally binding. They are, of course, voluntary, and let's go and see what are the differences between the Sustainable Development Goals and the Millennium Development Goals. Well, the 17 Sustainable Development Goals go further than the previous ones by covering more ground. Inequalities, economic growth, decent jobs, cities and human settlements, industrialization, oceans, ecosystems, energy, climate change, sustainable consumption and production, and peace and justice. The Sustainable Development Goals are universal and apply to all countries, whereas the Millennium Development Goals were intended for developing countries only, if you remember. If you're interested, you can watch this video and visit the official website of the UN for a complete list of the goals in more detail. And you will see that the UN suggests choosing one goal to support is a good way to start. However, all the goals are interlinked. So by supporting one goal, your actions will have positive impacts on other goals. So for example, promoting gender equality, which is goal number 5, in your school will help support a growing economy, which is goal number 8, and quality education for all, which is goal number 4. So there are some super easy things that we can adopt into our routines that if we all do it, will make a big, big difference. And for example, here you can check out the Lazy Person's Guide to Saving the World, which is kind of funny, but it's also really interesting and might give you some ideas about how to implement these goals into your lives. Now let's finish this lesson with the weaknesses and myths about the United Nations. The United Nations resolutions are only binding if they are approved by the permanent members of the UN Security Council. We talked about this in the previous lesson. We defined this the most undemocratic element in the United Nations. Any country that is not one of the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council needs to have at least one protector that is a member of that body to protect it against other world powers that may want to do it harm. For example, North Korea needs protectors such as China and Russia to veto any severe actions taken by the US and its allies. And the permanent members of the UN Security Council who take the most important decisions in the world, 3 out of 5 are Western countries. So there is not an equal representation of the other people in the world. So, for example, South America, Africa, and Oceania. The UN does not have a stable source of budget. It relies on member states to provide it with funds to operate. We talked about this also in the previous lesson. This creates a situation where the members providing most of the funds tend to have a bigger influence in the UN. For example, during the Trump administration in 2017, the US, which is the largest contributor to the UN, made a significant cut in its UN contribution because the General Assembly voted in favor of a resolution condemning the US recognition of Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. New contemporary global issues are jeopardizing its effectiveness, which means jeopardizing means compromettere. La capacità incisiva, no, della stessa organizzazione. For example, illicit arms trade and transnational terrorism. Infected UN peacekeepers from Nepal, there to help the population after the Haiti earthquake, were identified as the source of a cholera outbreak. Cholera is an infection of the small intestine, and transmission is usually through water, food, and poor sanitation. And this outbreak killed over 10,000 Haitians and sickened hundreds of thousands more. And then an investigation revealed in 2017 that over the past 12 years, there have been almost 2,000 accusations of sexual abuse and exploitation by peacekeepers around the world in Congo, Cambodia, and Haiti for the most part. Myth number 1, the UN is expensive. In fact, al contrario, for about 30 billion a year, the UN runs humanitarian, development, and peacekeeping operations around the world, and a year budget represents about 0.5% of global military spending. Myth number 2, the UN doesn't really do anything. In fact, we have just seen the UN feeds, shelters, vaccinates, educates millions of people every day. And myth number 3, wealthy countries do not need the UN. In fact, Western nations have many challenges too, from climate change to terrorism that cannot be faced in isolation. Here you can find a handbook about human rights that you can consult to learn more about this matter if you're interested. And that's it. Remember, if you couldn't understand something for whatever reason, you can comment down below. And as usual, there's the link to the script of this lesson in the video description and also the link to the Prezi. Thank you so much for listening.